So Kiki Tianqi is a writer, filmmaker, and curator, and my dear colleague here at QMUL. She's reader in cinematic arts here in the Department of Film at QMUL. Kiki's research explores cinema in relation to Asian philosophies, art histories, um, personal expression, and decolonization. She's the author of Myself on Camera, first-person documentary practice in individualizing China, came out in 2019. Co-editor of China's I Generation, Cinema, Moving Image Culture for the 21st Century, 2014, and Essay, Film, and Narrative Techniques, 2025. Kiki is also a filmmaker, and her award-winning films, including Memory of Home, 2009, China's Van Gogh, 2016, and The Two Lives of Li Armao, 2019, have been widely screened in international film festivals and arts institutions. Kiki is also a curator. Her practices include Spirit of Mountains and Water, Cosmological Thinking in Gao Shiqian's Moving Image Art, and Dancing with Water, Women's Cinema from Contemporary China, a film season which ran here in cinemas across London. You're going to continue a comparative reading of those things.
Thank you. Thank you, Annette. I'm going to read my paper to save the time and also to make sure I'm on track. The title of my paper today is Nothingness as Film, Ontology, Creates the Cinematic Engagement, Heidegger, Irigaray, and Daoism. Is it possible that cinema can breathe? Can cinema invite the viewer to breathe with moving image? In a time of sensory overload, can cinema hold nothing but unperceivable mortality? If cinematic nothingness exists, can it carry transformative forces, unfolding a meditative space where viewers can attend to their own breath? When breath itself becomes the index and of uneven exposure to risk in contemporary ecological and political crises, can cinema and art at large recreate the conditions of breathability? Against the backdrop of growing ecological crises, persistent political conflicts, rising anxieties over collective well-being, and rapid technological changes, I propose to reconsider what cinema can do. Can cinema go beyond merely reflecting or critiquing these conditions, but become a medium for reimagining modes of being? The contemplative nothingness and invocation of breathing and energetic flow in several recent films lead me to reimagine cinema as a medium, one that invites cinematic engagement through breathing. This includes Wim Wenders' Perfect Days, about public toilet cleaner in Tokyo, Other Little Things about wounded hummingbird in Los Angeles, Denis Villeneuve's sci-fi Arrival, Nicolas Dohate's sci-fi documentary, Au film Homo sapien, Chloe Zhao's Nomadlands, and Taming Liang's Aberdeen Nowhere. The repetitive cinematic rhythm, minimalist narrative, and often slow pace foreground the subtle change of totalities in this film, which cultivates viewers' own grace and their energetic being. What emerged here evokes a key concept in Chinese cosmology and broad East Asia culture, the notion of qi. Literally meaning as translated as breath or air, qi is often understood as vital energy, primal energy or vitality that exists in and permits everything. Qi also echoes prajna in Hindu. Exploring how cinema can render the seemingly impossible, invisible qi visible in my recent article, Cinema of Qi, I also have been thinking whether cinema has its own mortality. Like the breath-infused gesture of calligraphy, the embodied energetic flow in martial arts, qigong, and performance art, moving image may carry wisdom, a rhythm of qi, shaping not only what is seen, but also invites engagement through breathing. This realization opens a compelling new path for tracing cinema's often overlooked lineage within its Asian aesthetic traditions, whose transcultural impact are still largely understudied. Recent publication includes is about Tilotto's East Asian aesthetics and space of painting in 18th century Europe, and also Paul Glaston's observation of the influence of syncretic Taoist Buddhist inflated Neo-Confucius thinking and practices on the development of Western Romanism and early modernism. In this lineage, art is not merely a vehicle of expression, but a practice of body cultivation, one that cultivates qi for the creator as well as the viewer. Through this line of thinking, I've been writing my current second monograph, Cinema That Breathes, Daoist Film Philosophy and Meditative Cinema. It's built on my recent publications, wherein that theorizes film aesthetics through Daoism. My key questions include what is Daoist film ontology, or indeed film ontology, given Daoism's vital emphasis on the transformative nothingness? Can Daoism provide us with a different epistemology to experience cinema, one that's through vital energy? Does cinema has its own qi, or romantic vitality, qi yu, borrowing the traditional East Asian aesthetic concept informed by Daoism? So in this limited time, I will provide a very reduced answer to this question. A more extended discussion is in the introduction of this book and to other chapters. While writing this book, I also noticed very exciting philosophical resonances and divergences between Daoism and Irigaray and Heidegger, which I will also share today. At the turn of the 21st century, Irigaray draws inspiration from what she called Eastern yogic teachings and Brahmanian Indian spiritual practices, and investigates what it means to learn to breathe. Revising Western philosophy that has for a long term centered on the act of thinking, Irigaray brings attention to an essential but largely forgotten element of air and the practice of breathing. For her, air has been largely forgotten from Western philosophy precisely because, quote, air does not show itself. As such, it escapes appearing as a being. Irigaray not only affirms breathing as fundamental to life, but also foregrounds the ontological character of air, its modes of existence through non-presence. Irigaray's insight resonates with my own exploration of qi in cinema and the neglected role of non-being as part of existence, an element that's perhaps even more central in contemporary work making. Irigaray's draw primarily on Indian tradition, and I found Daoism very inspiring, while Irigaray regards breathing as a sign of autonomy that fundamentally forms individual subjectivity. For her, breathing corresponds to the first autonomous gesture of living human being. To come into the world supposes inhaling and exhaling of oneself. While breathing marks individuality, is also what connects all beings together. From this perspective, Daoist qi emphasizes all beings, all breathing beings and things are situated within the interconnected and holistic one, continuously participating in the transformation of vital energy, which is ultimately grounded in the creative and regenerative nothingness. While cinema has been intensively discussed through the lineage of European art tradition, based on the scientific vantage point perspective developed during the Renaissance, cinema continues the function of painting as a representational object viewed by a human subject, or what Carroll called detached display. It is a way of looking restrained by the frame, as the art critic Roger Fryer criticized. In his limited account of cinema, Heidegger regards cinema as the manifestation of Western culture's fundamental modernist called subjectivized technological Cartesian way of looking at the world in the early 20th century. This Genealogy of European art history likewise highlights art's enduring pursuit of imitating reality, a foundation upon which Andrew Bazin famously constructed his ontological realism of cinema. For Bazin, this tradition follows a mummy complex to keep the continued existence of the dead corporal body, and provide a defense against the passage of time. Drawing on to the Andrew's account of the historical forces shaping Bazin's realist film ontology during the final years of the Nazi occupation, Victor Fan discusses how Bazin's thinking is based on two blueprints. First, photographic image as a traces of photographic being, and second, how it's motivated by a death drive. Underlying the Bazinian or preoccupation of realism lies a modern Western metaphysical understanding of death absent one that differs fundamentally from the Taoist one. Traditional Chinese art did not place its key concern on the death drive, and painting's relationship with reality is never a quest for realistic mimicking, but a spiritual resonance. Art often born of desire to connect with the natural rhythm of life, represented by Tao, that follows the creative process of self-emergence. This does not imply that Taoist lacks of fear of death. Indeed, the pursuit of immortality has been central to Taoist practice of bio-spiritual growth, 意识, and Taoist inward alchemy, bio-spiritual techniques, and everyday practice of nourishing life, 养生, aim to preserve or even prolong the vital essence of life. However, its core is not to maintain the bodily physical form, 形, but on understanding the essence, 精, and cultivating vitality, 气, and the spirit, 神. Emphasize on the likeness in spirit rather than in form, and the complementary opposite in Chinese and East Asian art at large reflect a mythology that values the correlations of being, non-being, set, unset, virtual, and factual, as both David and Paul mentioned earlier. This is deeply embedded in the aesthetics formation of landscape painting, 山水, which itself means mountains and waters, indicating the stillness and the movement, the high and the low, the solid and the fluid. Non-being or nothingness is not to be dismissed, but open spaces of imagination. Taoist cosmology regards non-being to fundamental principles, frame them not as absent or impossibility to be feared, but a generative potentiality, the very condition of life's unfold. In their philosophical translation of Daoism, Roger Metz and David Hall states that the Chinese extension verb 有 overlaps with the sense of having rather than the copula. Therefore means to be present or to be around. Wu then here translated as nothing, meaning not to be present or not to be around. For David Chai, Wu is to both the ontic non-being mutually depends on the ontic being and the ontological nothingness, which manifests in the Abyssinian form of emptiness, white space, shallows, and void, etc. This Abyssinian form of nothingness is not simply absent, for its presence can be felt. Nothingness creates an open space through which things relate and resonate with one another. Being and non-being correlate with together, forming oneness, and each thing also encompassing various forms of nothingness. It differs from lacking, non-existence in Western metaphysics. It also differs from Nietzsche's active nihilism that sees the collapse of universal values produce a sense of groundlessness that can awaken human beings for their own creative potential, while in Daoism, Tao itself is described as empty, yet unfolding through a self-generative process of spontaneous emergence. In this view, nothingness itself is intrinsically creative and generative. and the Taoist emphasis of usefulness through examples of many stories such as the crooked tree and empty vase. For example, as it states in the chapter 11 of the Tao Te Ching, we throw clay to shape a pot, but its utility of the clay pot is the function of nothingness inside it. Thus, it might be something that provides value, but it's nothing that provides utility. In Heidegger's theorization of things in his later thought of life, when he was deeply influenced by Daoism, he also used a similar metaphor of jar in his essay, The Thing, to assert that the vase of thingness does not lie at all in the material of which it consists, but in the void that holds. In Taoist meontological cosmology, all entities, beings, or inanimated, emerge from the one and embody both being and non-being. And for Eric Nielsen, the use of Wu, non-expression, in the concept of emptiness, uselessness in early Taoist texts indicates practices of emptying and strategies of unfixing, so to maintain generative potentiality. And I propose to trace that if we want to trace film genealogy through Chinese art history, is in fact to think cinema through Taoist meontological cosmology. Through this strand of thought, cinema is not seen as a mimic of reality, motivated by the death drive. Instead, the creative and regenerative forces of ontological nothingness enables cinematic potentiality. Even in this sense, Bazin's realistic ontology cinema presents reality through absence. The physical object is no longer there, only its trace. And it is precisely this non-physical representation, imprint of what is no longer there, that constitutes the ontological condition of film. Cinema's vitality, then, does not arise from physical reproduction of beings, but from the dynamic interplays between being, non-being, present, and absent. The materiality of film itself also relies on the emptiness for its function. And since Daoism argued that meontological nothingness is not a separate thing, but the inherent quality of all things, films do not produce emptiness. Rather, it rendered such ontological emptiness of the world more perceivable. Cinematic nothingness can be manifest as what is often called the mundane daily routines, repetitive actions, seemingly insignificant moments, the dead time, the empty shot, the stillness, the shadows, the dark, and the after hours. This resonates with traditional Chinese techniques of 虚实相生, the mutual generation of the virtual and factual. In classic Chinese landscape painting and poetics, emptiness is frequently articulated through the techniques of liu bai, the white space of leaving things blank. This can also be manifest in the narrative halt or narrative restraint, traces of what already happened or what is about to happen, the despairing, the withholding. For example, Hitchcock used of nothing to create suspense in his thriller. Similar nothing, this active force that shapes film's world and the viewer's experience. Rather than regarding cinema extension of screen saturation, I argue that cinema, while Taoist meontology cosmology reviews cinema as its own counter-practice, a medium capable of restoring stillness, fostering meditation, and reimagining our duality in the world. Audiences are invited to duel within or fill in what is not on the screen. The invocation of nothing as a generative, affective space prompts reflections on what is valuable, and cinematic nothingness may appear useless, yet disclosing ourselves to such emptiness help us cultivate a heightened experience and awareness of the present. Thus, it also invites a meditative engagement from the viewer, experience that allows a tuning to the subtle transformation of vital energy, manifest through the shifting lights, movement, and sound. While Taoist film phenomenology that regards cinema as grounded in nothingness is essentially a phenomenological approach that foregrounds the reciprocal relationship between film and embodied viewer. Such a Daoist film experience is non-dualistic, less intentional, mediated through qi, manifested through breathing. It departs from the mode of eye or the ocular-centric paradigms, where cinema is emphasized as representation of views, or pure text seen through a disembodied audience. It also differs from the rich scholarship that regards cinema as brain or consciousness. Film criminology, pioneered by Vivian Saltrap, marks a vital contribution to the effective turn in Anglophone scholarship in the 1990s. Through Merleau-Ponty, Saltrap famously argued, we do not experience any movies through our eyes. We see and comprehend and feel films with our entire bodily being. Recent film phenomenology has expanded this to engage with other strands of modern Western phenomenologist thinking, including Heidegger. However, non-Western thoughts with phenomenological resonance rarely enters the debate. You have to quote David again. David asserts that Daoism touches upon issues in phenomenological debate or philosophical thinkings in such a way that two traditions mutually resonate with one another. While Daoist film phenomenology agree that we feel films with our entirely bodily being, as the viewer's breathing body exposed to the cinematic world, is also going beyond the Merleau-Ponty approach that regards cinema as intentional being, or what Saltrap calls cinema as intentional technology. As the Daoist approach resonates more with Heideggerian approach that emphasizes on Dasein, disclosure, mood, and being in the world. In Sean Loft's phenomenology of film, a Heideggerian account of film experience, he reconsiders films through Heidegger's philosophy of art, especially his article, The Origin of Work of Art, and his notion of Dasein being here. I agree with Loft's Heideggerian approach that sees cinema as sides of meaning that Dasein inherently connects to. Via Heidegger, Loft argued that film image arises from poetic magnification of being, and film viewing exemplifies an instant's being in the world, which involved a reciprocal process of disclosure. Films reveal themselves temporarily to the viewer, while the viewer, through an attitude of openness, enables this revelation to take place. In this Heideggerian approach, films are meaningful because Dasein's participation in their disclosure, the viewer's openness and engagement are essential for truth to emerge. Meaning is thus existential, ontological, grounded in Dasein's being in the world. However, a Daoist approach decenters Dasein as the locus. Disclosure is not anchored in existential here, but in the self-generative rhythm of Dao, spontaneous self-emergence. It further discusses through the notion of intentionality. Heidegger rejects intentionality as an adequate model of consciousness, denouncing intentionality as too narrowly characterizing humans being in the world. Heidegger preferred to use comportment, a more diffuse, practical mode of engagement with one's surroundings. On this basis, Locke's Heideggerian account suggests that film viewing as a more holistic model of comportment, such that film viewing is not merely a cognitive or intentional state, but instead just a state of being. And my Daoist approach agrees with Locke, but develops further to argue that such a state of being is enacted through qi, breathing, as a way of tuning to the cinematic world. By describing spectatorship not as limited to intentionality, I do not suggest that audience become entirely passive. Rather, cinema can release viewer from the habitual forms of intention that govern engagement with plot-driven narratives. And this approach expands Jennifer Barker's 3 levels of immersion in phenomenological film viewing discussed in her book The Tactic Eye. Barker discussed the skin, the muscular, and the visceral. Bracing as an innate gut response indicates an energetic attunement or energetic relationality. To highlight the cinematic engagement through phrase, I also ask, what's enabled such a phenomenological and physical emotional connection between the kinetic qi in the cinematic world and the qi of the audience. It is possible that cinema itself also contains qi, the way cinema breaks. Again, I found this very useful and productive to turn to Chinese art history, where the concept of dramatic vitality, qi yun, become very useful in connecting cinema with an art tradition that dramatic vitality of art has intensively discussed. Dramatic vitality, qi yun, emphasize the inner life force of an artwork, the fusion of movement, form, and effect, which cannot be reduced to simply techniques alone, but connects strongly and essentially with the vitality of artists who create the work. For example, the film by Tong Wenming that Paul just shown is not just a representation of the burning fire and her spontaneous action, but her own vitality that's on screen. It's less about accurate representation, more about capturing a living energy. And this term itself, which I just briefly mentioned here, was originally mentioned by Chinese art theorist Xie He during the Chinese Nan Dynasty, and as one of his 6 canons of Chinese painting. And then it's been translated in English in the early 20th century, and in fact deeply influenced the development of Western modern art theory, especially Roger Freier's modern formalist aesthetics. But this, in fact, in turn, will influence cinema, but has been much less discussed. We talk about cinema's rhythm, but this rhythm that I intend to explore is not just the perceived, it's the felt, it's the breathing, it's the tension release, the duration, and the pause. It's something that embodies energetic, synchronizes ways. This resonates with Martin Heidegger's idea that meaning emerged through unfolding rather than static presence, and cinematic vitality is not just about this rhyme and rhythm, but about how movement, cut, stillness, repetitions, and silence all together generate a kind of life force within film. And dramatic vitality redefines engagement from attention to attunement, and instead of paying attention to the visual and mental, paying our mental attention to the cinematic things or following the narrative, engagement through qi suggests attuning oneself to film's vitality, and is less about control, an act of cognitive mastery, than one of receptive participation. So I will end here. A more detailed discussion is in the book, and I also look forward to discuss more and receive comments today, so to further enrich my writing. Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for this 2 fascinating talks again. And so for Paul, I have a question because you mentioned Derrida many times. And do you think, well, my question is actually when you were mentioning yin yang and Derrida's sort of this dualism.
Difference.
Okay.
That's one word.
Okay. So you basically you don't. Oh yeah. Yeah, I think that already answered my question. So.
Well, I think the point is that Derrida talks about difference just being one flawed way of talking about the thing he wants to talk about. He uses all sorts of other terms like spacing and all this kind of thing if you read his writing.
Yeah.
But there's a certain resonance between the non-rationalist thought or conception that Derrida's getting at and what yin yang is about. But of course, and this is where Cora comes in, and it's interesting, this is where the earthenware vessel within the Lao Tzu comes in, is that these are very resonant terms. They're not identical there, they're quite in different directions.
Yeah, can I edit on that? Is I think what I'm thinking was not DEFCONs, but is the minor literature also mentioned by Derrida. Think about kind of the dualism in this way, and I think for Derrida is thinking of the dual things are having the natural hierarchy in it. It's like you always have like a bigger point, the heavier point, in or the dualism systems in that. While in yin yang, I'm not saying yin yang is equal always the balance, because you mentioned the Daoism yin yang, Confucianism yin yang. I think they are very different. Yeah, so I would like to hear about that part.
I think two things. Derrida is drawing attention to the way that classical weighted dialectics in the Western European philosophical tradition, how that deconstructively undoes itself. You don't enact deconstruction, you observe it. It's inherent to linguistic representation. And he's showing the kind of classical philosophical dialectics that you're talking about, how it deconstructs itself. Where difference comes in is that's the mechanism, as far as he can draw attention to it, because it's ineffable and unknowable and needy. But he's trying to show you the mechanism through which that demonstration can take place. So we have to make a distinction between the classical dialectics that Derrida is deconstructing and the terminology he's using of this non-rationalist dialectics that he's using to try to, or conceiving of, or observing to draw attention to that inherent deconstruction. Now the second bit, is the bit that has some resonance with the non-rationalist, and I mean non/rationalist dialectics that we find in the Chinese classical tradition, which of course precedes Daoism. It's immemorial to Chinese attitudes. They're not the same, they point in different directions, but they have a resonance.
Thank you. Because my whole thesis is based on yin yang, so can I reach to you maybe later? After.
Sure, if you think it's helpful. I mean, I have to say, just very, very, very quickly, that it was very helpful to have coming afterwards, because I think we were talking about pretty much the same thing, but in different ways. So in her talk, Cora is echoed in the Lao Tzu's discussion of the earthenware vessel, and it's the emptiness that is productive and useful.
A quick question for Kiki. I think you are getting there, so I want to know more how you're understanding when you're talking about Heidegger's usage of the metaphor of jar. Because Heidegger, in the article, when he talked about the jar or the thing in general, he was also talking about the true meaning or the undisclosement of the meanings, kind of like when an object is detached from its utility or design purpose. So I was wondering if this process of detachment anyhow relevant or necessary to the process of understanding the breadth of cinema, or even the Bazinian way of defining cinema's ontology as an interplay between being and non-being, presence and absence.
Well, I think to talk about Heidegger, I feel I'm a bit inadequate, because David, of course, have lots of comments on that. But I think if we talk about Heidegger, we really have to stimulate his thinking in the particular stage of his life at the time, historical time, when he talked about this. This is in the late 1940s, early 50s, and he's also in a way kind of justifying his political position as well, this disclosure, and also the non-intentional states and non-intentional exposure to the world as his own political position at the time. I hope that answers your first question. Well, regarding what's Bazin's emphasis on this photographic realism, the imprint of what is already gone. I think that also echoes what David was talking about earlier. The darkness, is nothing is there. The lights shine on this to enable something to emerge. Well, for Bazin, is you capture that, but that's already gone. So what you have is already an representation of the traces, rather than what is already there. But for me, what is interesting is to see that cinema historically is not just about what is there. It's never about what is there, because the form itself is already what is not there. Yeah, the meaning is appear on screen, is gone. Yeah.
That's a detachment. In a way.
Yeah, but I wouldn't. Yeah, think through the way of detachment. Yeah.
I think maybe, I mean, you know that Derrida's writing is partly a critical dialogue with Heidegger.
Yes.
And what Derrida tries to show, as he does with other philosophers, is that there is still an inherent metaphysics to Heidegger. And one problem with that are ideas of separation, detachment. One could never achieve that attachment in an absolute way.
No, definitely not. So perhaps we can think in terms of other words, such as transformation or
Spacing, difference,
process,
whatever you like. Or yin yang and Daoism.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Thank you.
I think we have time for two more questions. Silke at the back, and then there's a question on the subject. So go ahead, Silke.
Yeah, thank you, Kiki. That was really, really interesting talk. And yeah, so you're arguing that cinema itself is a form of energy, and of course I'm worried about that there is no one anymore. That breathing isn't about I don't know, like we know from COVID, breathing affects others. It's not just about an entity like cinema that breathes. It's cinema can also show relations that of affections between things and beings. And do these beings all disappear into the cinema? So only the cinema or the Dao breathes, and
It's very interesting questions. Yeah, I think one of my questions is, how we talk about breathability in this, crisis, ecological, being able to breathe, physically, the pollution of air, and also politically, being beaten to death, you can't, you're out of breath, in the matter of things like that, able to breathe, to be in this world. But in this context, I think cinema is important to be able to create this space of meditation, and sometimes how to deal with our anger, deal with the frustration against the current political, ecological situation, whether this can just to provide a space for us to recollect ourselves and then to react to the world. So I also take these as different forms of activism. When activism is all about, bring everything out and making provocation, or it can be a different form of act, effortlessly, or hopefully more effortlessly, more attuned to the energy and things around us.
Doesn't have to be literally. Kiki very usefully mentioned Qiyun. And I think full term in Xi'an is Qiyun, which has been badly translated in many respects, but is often come out in English as vital energy resonance. And that's meant to activate the depiction in particularly Shanshui painting. But it's not just the picture that it animates, but it's the relationship between the artist or the painter, more accurately, and nature, and between the viewer and the artist and the viewer and nature, and the relationship of all of that to society. So one could take a lead from that and think of breath in the context of cinema or art or whatever as not being a literal thing, not being signified in a kind of literal way, but something that inhabits the work and its wider resonances.
I think that if I understood Silke's question correctly, there's an underlying issue around that we haven't properly named around violence and force and relationship between what Daoism brings to discussions about cinema and violence, but should we mention it at the beginning? But we had one more question here.
Yeah.
Did you? Can we squeeze in another question after that? Okay.
Well,
You can just keep it
Yeah,
concise.
okay, so I guess mine will probably be things to unpack over lunch if we can, because a comment to each paper maybe, if that's okay, and then I'll take the answers over lunch so that we don't waste time. So my first one is to you, Kiki. I really like the idea of using qi to understand the breadth of cinema, but it takes me back to Francois Julien's book on Shi and the way in which breath is mobilized there. And he goes back to the art of war and takes the metaphor, the material image of the crossbow drawn and cocks ready with its energy distributed about it. And he thinks about that as the way in which breath is mobilized in art, and it just is waiting for the viewer to become the target or the client in order to fire, and the breath of the object can move into you. I think that's really nice. I think about that as dragon's breath as well. And Paul, I was struck by your image of the urinal, and perhaps because I'm a certain age and my bladder's telling me things I couldn't get the urinal out in my mind. But Grayson Perry talks about how that particular urinal got chucked in the skip and smashed. They had to commission a potter, and this is why it's of interest to him, to recreate it as such, as a kind of like a simulacra of the
Slightly incorrect narrative. Nobody really knows what happened to the original urinal, which was purchased from a plumber's shop.
right.
But definitely by the time you get to the 1960s, the demand from museums and the institutionalization of the work mean that Duchamp has to collaborate in reconstructions, of which there are many. So if you go to Tate, there's a version of Fountain, but it's neither the original, if there's such a thing, nor is it unbroken. It had to be fixed because it was broken. But it's not. It's a sculpture.
Mm.
The version in the Tate is not a urinal from a plumber's shop. It's a sculptural version of whatever was presented in 1917 in New York.
I think that has some weird resonance with cinema.
Oh yeah. Mm. I mean, very briefly. As Derrida would say, all of those definitions are always already too late. So what Duchamp does, he doesn't define it as deconstruction. He simply does what he does, and he writes a few things about it, and then it comes to be interpreted from a post-structuralist point of view later. But that discussion, of course, is late. It's belated. The thing has already been done, and the point is that Duchamp is already pointing out the Eucharistic significance of art more generally in the Western tradition. Everybody is too late. And on time.
Yeah, I think on that note, we'll take a very quick question and break for lunch. Oh, sorry. Do you wanna respond? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, just perhaps very quickly. In the Shi, in a way, is also accumulating of vitality, or experience of it. Right. Yeah, I'm just leaving.
I like the violence thing, and just one quick thing to say is when you look at all of this in the syncretic classical Chinese tradition, particularly in relation to Confucianism, which is much more focused on the world and society, then these questions of violence and the nature of state violence and resistance to it and the way you resist it are very much woven into that discursive, syncretic discursive discussion. You could raise that up too. relation to cinema.
I'm here to learn, and this is just, yeah, that's really, I think that's really cool.
Everybody should know about the Chinese classical tradition because it is so crucially, it's the same but different to the Western discursive tradition. It's the same bits but organised in a different way.
Thank you.
That's why
Okay,
we
what-
have this whole conference.
Yeah,
Exactly.
no, exactly. Yes, go ahead.
Actually, because you have talked about the differences between the Western thinkings and the Chinese thinking, so I'm thinking, my question is more about, will you think this Daoism cinema or the series that we're trying to build here will be a certain geographical region that will be more suitable for it, or not in that sense? Because Heidegger, in his work, anyway, he mentioned like existence and time, and the Japanese philosopher Ontology, he developed the Fengtu, and this theory of Fengtu has emphasized largely the geographical and historical facts. So basically, it's my question: will it be more suitable for regions or not?
Well, this is a methodological question, isn't it? In fact, why first just talk about my experience of considering the book and the projects. I didn't really limit myself to the Chinese cinema or Sinophone cinema or even East Asian cinema. Not because that's a very perfect example. You can find resonances, and also there's cultural roots of it. But I found what's in Daoism of the emphasis on different understanding of the non-being, the darkness, the nothingness, really can contribute to the human experience of what is the opposite of this non-being. And I'm more not less about geographical space, more about temporality. What Daoism or Chinese thinking can help us to navigate contemporary issues and all these problems we have today.
Just one quick thing. Going back to the title of the exhibition we just opened, contemporary video art from the Sinosphere. The Sinosphere is deliberately inserted to break up this abiding dominance of mainland China over the interpretations of Chinese art. It's a very relevant context, has its own particular circumstances. The Sinosphere is much wider than that. It has no fixed internal boundaries nor external boundaries. It's a cultural linguistic space. It's not all collection of space, it's a myriad of spaces. So it definitely applies to those Sinophone contexts where there's a Chinese cultural habitus which still has the traces of all of this. But my argument is that it's also relevant to this discussion about the transcultural construction of art. Because if we just think of contemporary art as being at least open to interpretation as being deconstructed throughout, then the ideas that are being raised here are relevant to those contexts. Well, the Sinosphere has no limits. It has differentiate. It's like Tianqi. It's the empire that has a centre but no edges. But it's not an empire you can control everything.
Because you also written about we need to avoid essentialism by doing this kind of east-west split.
It's misleading. I think you've got to be specific, and I think you can be culturally specific, but that's not the same as essentialism, obviously.
Yeah, how do we navigate all this? Because everything is so mutually influenced these days. We rarely talk about essentialist was Taoist thinking, or was essentialists Heidegger or Deleuze thinking not built on everything else. We talk about at this moment, at this historical stage, how these traditions can still guide us, as they're always they are living traditions. How do we deal with them?
But they're traces, they're not like absolute continuity. And all cultures,
Reinventing.
yes, constantly, and that fits in with everything we use. All cultures are always already transcultural.
I mean, I did, in reading your work, I did wonder if it's not so much in terms of geography, but in terms of kind of genre or style, if it's applicable beyond. It seems to kind of be very, very nicely aligned with slow cinema. But, do we want to get beyond that?
I
Yeah,
think that, sorry.
Yeah, I did spend quite a lot of time trying to, build on the existing theorization of slow cinema, but to define what is meditative cinema. And for me, my recent discovery is all these dance films. They are not slow, but the dramatic and the repetitive. And then I found it's the repetition in everyday life, it's the routine, it's the making, it's about now. And it's about a kind of energetic engagement with the moving image. And that somehow kind of release our, cognitive thinking.
As the question.
Yeah.
Kind of that's really
That's a move, yeah.
It is a movement, please. Quick thing, I would argue that one can draw attention to those obvious synergies. But the reason why I made the shift in my talk away from the Wu Wei was that it's kind of obvious. What I would argue is that all of cinema has these elements in it. It doesn't have to be signified in an obvious way.
I think that's all we have time for, so please join me in applause.